Okay, guys, welcome to your APUSH Chapter 7 video here. Hammering out a Federal Republic, 1787 to 1820. Basically, the bell. Basically, this is early American history, following the ratification, of course, of the Constitution. So let's talk about the political crisis of the 1790s and the implementation of the Constitution. You have a new government. The Constitution gets ratified. You have a new government with a new position, the executive position of president. And George Washington is unanimously chosen to be the first president of the United States. So he doesn't go through the traditional election process like everyone else who follows. He has this incredible cabinet. Secretary of State's Thomas Jefferson. His Secretary of Treasury is Alexander Hamilton. Secretary of War is Henry Knox. I mean, it's an all-star cast, very talented government. We also get the Judiciary Act of 1789, which you need to know it's important because it's what creates the third of our three branches, the Supreme Court. And it provides for 6 justices and lower courts as well. Now, without the Bill of Rights, you're not going to get the new Constitution ratified. It was the must-have scenario for anti-federalists like Thomas Jefferson and others to agree to support it. It originally actually started off with 19 amendments and got whittled down to 10. And those 10 amendments will be the first 10 amendments to the Constitution of the United States of America. And again, that it makes anti-federalists comfortable enough with this new government to support it. All right, so Alexander Hamilton is our Secretary of Treasury, and he is going to be responsible for the financial system that gets America up and going. That's why he's incredibly important. He believes that we've got to make sure we have good public credit, that people are willing to loan us money as a nation, as a country. He advocates buying back all the loans that are out there, plus interest. And, he has this very controversial plan of doing this. And you have land speculators, or not land speculators, but speculators in this money business that are buying up these bonds at very cheap prices. Basically, it's a money scam for some rich people. So there are some critics who knew this was going to happen, and there were some people who knew this was going to happen, and they bought up some of these bonds for cheap, and then it's a big scam, basically. So Hamilton also proposes assuming all of the state debts into a national debt and taking that on as a national government. But for many anti-federalists and Southerners, they're not really supportive of Alexander Hamilton. So they basically broker a compromise where a brand new national capital will be created in the South. They're going to call it Washington, D.C., named after George Washington, of course. And Washington, D.C. is in the South. So the Southerners get the capital in their area. And you start seeing this early South versus North thing here. That Hamilton's okay with that. To get his financial plans passed, he's willing to do that. And that's where the government goes. So Hamilton favors a national debt. He thinks it's a blessing as long as it's within reason. Because it shows that we're trying to be better as a country. We're creating things, we're building things. With Hamilton, you always associate Hamilton with the BUS, the Bank of the United States. It's the cornerstone of his financial plan. It's going to provide loans to businesses and help the economy. It's a huge deal. Most people are having to take loans out to start businesses. They're going to take it out from the Bank of the United States to do so. You also have something you need to know, strict versus loose interpretation of the Constitution. So strict interpretation is like literal interpretation of the Constitution. You're taking it word for word. It means black and white what it says. Loose interpretation is the idea that, there are metaphors in there and that, the spirit of the amendment or the spirit of the words being said. Famous strict interpretist is Thomas Jefferson, who will actually have to go back on his own beliefs as president when he takes on the Louisiana Purchase. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. We're going to try to raise revenue through tariffs. And tariffs is a fancy word for tax. We put an excise tax on domestic goods, so home goods and goods made in America. And then we put a tariff on imported goods. So you're buying from Britain, there's going to be a tariff placed on it. That helps protect domestic manufacturers here in America, made in America products, basically, from cheaper British products. And it puts money in the government's coffers. So it's twofold there. Now, we have a lot of division in this time period. You have Jeffersonians versus Hamiltonians. You have pro-French versus pro-British. Jefferson's got this agrarian vision, this vision of a nation of farmers. You know, he's technically a farmer. He's a plantation owner, so he has an enormous farm with hundreds of slaves, and he's a very wealthy man. But that's his vision of what America could be, supplying food, cash crops, things like that. Whereas Hamilton has very much a different view. So the Hamiltonians are the Federalists. Jeffersonians are the Republicans. Should be able to keep those pretty straight. And Jefferson believed that farmers were the backbone of the economy. But we also have this big event that happens in 1789, which is the French Revolution. And it is, without a doubt, linked to us, of course, because remember, the French supported America during the American Revolution. Now they've had a revolution of their own, but their revolution is incredibly bloody and it's very violent. And many Americans are shocked by how violent it is. Tens of thousands of people losing their head to the guillotine, tons of murders and stuff. It's much bloodier. It's much more revolutionary than what we had in our very conservative revolution. So people are beginning to choose sides. There are people who think the French have gone too far, so they're not going to support the French Revolution. And there are others who are saying, hey, listen, without them, we wouldn't have won the American Revolution. We owe them our support. Their revolution's based off the same Enlightenment ideals as our own. Now, George Washington himself always associated him with neutrality. He issues a proclamation basically that America is going to remain neutral in the conflict between Britain and France. Britain and France are going to war for about the billionth time. And Washington's idea is we're new, we're weak. We don't need to get caught up choosing sides right now. We're still trying to make it as a country. But Jeffersonians saw, like I said, the French Revolution as an extension of the American Revolution. And so they're pushing for support of France. You have the Whiskey Rebellion, which goes on in this time period. It happens in Pennsylvania, where the farmers rebel against that excise tax passed by Mr. Hamilton. But the government, the national government, sends out troops and they crush it. And the Whiskey Rebellion is important because it shows that our government can put down dissension. Now, others, I'm sure, are nervous because now it looks like, oh, well, the government's very big and scary. That you have a right protected by the Constitution to protest. Jay's Treaty. John Jay goes and he brokers this treaty with Britain because Britain was, they were doing things. They were taking things like impressment. They were taking American soldiers or American sailors, and they were disappearing. And all of a sudden they turn up, in the British Navy. In Jay's Treaty, he hoped to protect the ships, but he's not going to get a whole lot accomplished. And most people are very derisive of Jay's Treaty. One of the things that Britain had to give up was they had to make their troops leave from Western forts. So believe it or not, after the American Revolution, there were still, we got territory all the way to the Mississippi River, but out west, there were still British forts, and the British were arming Indians and stirring Indians up against Americans. This is an actual thing going on. And he says, hey, you've got to get them out of our country. That is our country. You don't belong here. And so it is one thing that he wins for America. However, he doesn't really force Britain to do anything about their treatment of American ships in the Atlantic. Also to the south, you have the Haitian Revolution, which is also inspired by both the American and the French revolutions. The Haitians were controlled by the French. You had Toussaint L'Ouverture, kind of the Black George Washington, as he's sometimes known, helps Haiti gain its independence, really the only successful slave uprising in history, really. Many U.S. slaveholders, very important, fear the impact of the revolution on their slaves. So you have a weird dynamic. You have these revolutionary ideals, Enlightenment ideals, but we don't want those ideals spreading to women. We don't want those ideals spreading to slaves. So Southerners are certainly afraid that this successful Haitian independence could spread north and cost them a lot of money. This is a time of the rise of political parties following Washington. When Washington leaves office, he has a famous farewell address where he warns Americans of political parties and how divisive they are, and he sees them as destructive to America, to this young country that he fought for. But we're going to get them nonetheless. Now, where it says Republicans, you'll often see that listed as Democrat Republicans, Democrat-Republicans. And they tended to be farmers, both Western farmers and Southern farmers. Also tended to be immigrants and subsistence farmers in the North. And they were pro-French, and they wanted more power to the states. That's a Democrat-Republican, basically the anti-federalists. They're not anti-federalists anymore because we have ratified the Constitution, but there's still a group who sees the world differently than Federalists will. We get a new president after George Washington. His name is John Adams. He beats out his big-time rival, Thomas Jefferson, to become president. Weirdly enough, Thomas Jefferson, even though he was his big rival, becomes his vice president because of a weird rule that they end up fixing. After that, presidents and vice presidents will run on a ticket together. So if you vote the president in, you're voting in the vice president. Whereas in this case, Thomas Jefferson finished second, and so he became the vice president. And those two don't need to be in the same room together. So they fixed that issue. So under John Adams, one term, he served one term, 4 years. Probably the biggest things that happened is the XYZ affair. We send diplomats to France to deal with them, to talk with them, discuss, and they demand a $250,000 bribe from those 3 U.S. ambassadors to be able to see the French leadership. We were embarrassed. We were humiliated. We were angry that we were treated like this. And so many people in America who are anti-French, they're ready to go to war against France because of this. Now, John Adams is a very thin-skinned man. He is, although he's a founding father and very important in a lot of ways, as a president, he did not like being questioned. And so he passed some really bad things. Naturalization, Alien, and Sedition Acts are all things you have to know. Note card them up if you have to. He does them to silence opposition to his group, the Federalists, because, like I said, he couldn't handle being criticized in the papers. He couldn't handle criticism. In the Naturalization Act, it increased the residency requirement from 5 to 14 years. Because look up here, immigrants tended to be Democrat Republicans. So he's not all that interested in letting more foreigners into the country, basically to go against him. So he wants you to live here for 14 years before you can become an American citizen. Under the Alien Act, he can actually deport foreigners. So what does that mean? Well, all these new Democrat Republicans, these immigrants, they're technically foreigners because they haven't been here for 14 years. So if they say something bad about him, he can just ship them off. And, they don't have citizenship rights. They're not protected by the Constitution. So you can just get them out of there. Just an easy way for him to get rid of his enemies. And then lastly, has the Sedition Act, which makes it illegal to criticize the government. People, as you can imagine, Democrat Republicans are very critical of this, and probably a big reason why he's only going to be a one-term president. So speaking of his presidency, when the next election rolls around, because it's been 4 years, he's up against Thomas Jefferson again. And this time the people have seen too much of John Adams, and they decided that they want to try out the other guy, in this case, Thomas Jefferson. And we get something called the Revolution of 1800, or the Bloodless Revolution. We are transitioning power from one political party to the other. Not a single person died. It was as far as historically speaking, it was a very nice exchange of power. There was just a few petty things that John Adams did, but for transfer of power, it's almost unprecedented. And at his inaugural address, Thomas Jefferson says, "We are all Republicans. We're all Federalists." Thomas Jefferson's an interesting guy. Soft-spoken. He did not have a powerful carrying voice. He was most well known for his incredible writing skills, but he walked to his inauguration. He would often meet people in his dinner robe at his house. He was a very laid-back guy. So a lot of interesting historical anecdotes about Thomas Jefferson. So here we go. Continuing. A Republican empire is born. After the Revolutionary War, natives, as you can imagine, are getting pushed further and further west. We get some bad treaties, such as the Treaty of Greenville, and because you had this confederacy of Indians that were giving us problems, but under the Treaty of Greenville, they're going to end up ceding most of the Ohio River Valley to the Americans. And the natives, that what we want is natives to assimilate, to join our culture, because we see ourselves as the dominant culture. But the natives don't really like our culture because it's so contrary to their own way of life. But it's not going to matter. We're, as you know, the end of the story. We're going to continue to push west. We're going to continue to take their lands, and they're going to continue to die. All right, so migration. Southern migrants, there were a few wealthy individuals who owned large amounts of land in the South, these plantation owners, if you will, who own thousands of acres. Only about half of white men actually own land in Kentucky. The rest of the white men in Kentucky worked on a rich person's lands as tenant farmers. Cotton becomes king. This expansions, the expansion south and west, it's not going to be tobacco. It's going to be cotton. Cotton's going to be the crop as we expand as a nation. So a little bit about Jefferson's presidency. He continues on the Virginia dynasty. Remember that that George Washington was from Virginia. Thomas Jefferson's from Virginia. James Madison, who's next, is from Virginia, and then James Monroe is also from Virginia. So all of our early presidents, with the exception of John Adams, were from Virginia. Now, Jefferson has to deal with a judicial branch that was packed full of Federalists, and they were all appointed at basically right before midnight before Thomas Jefferson took his office as president. It was a petty move by John Adams to basically make things rough on Thomas Jefferson. And one of these guys, Marbury is going to be a judge, and Jefferson's going to say that, hey, these didn't go, the paperwork didn't get passed in time because he doesn't want to be stuck with all these Federalist judges. So there's a lawsuit that ensues, Marbury versus Madison. And the most important thing you need to know, Marbury versus Madison, is a must know. It's a note card item, is that the Supreme Court can rule a law unconstitutional. So if we pass an amendment, or if we pass a law, it cannot go against the Constitution. And so it's very important in that regard. Jefferson's administration would end up eliminating the excise tax. However, even though Jefferson and Hamilton typically butted heads, they would keep the Bank of the United States. All right, so still moving west, we're really kind of kicking into gear for Manifest Destiny. We get Pinckney's Treaty between the United States and Spain, and it says that the United States can navigate the Mississippi and store goods in New Orleans, which is at the mouth of the Mississippi, of course. Very important. I think it also shows that America's growing in prestige, that we can get this treaty passed. And the most important thing of Jefferson's presidency, without a doubt, is the Louisiana Purchase. We buy it from Napoleon, who's struggling in his battles against Britain. We're going to buy it for $15 million, which was about 3 cents an acre. And there's nothing in the Constitution that says the president can broker the buying of land. So he has to loosely interpret some of the wording in the Constitution to go ahead and broker this deal. And people trashed him for it, called him a hypocrite. So he did take some heat for it. But within a short amount of time, everybody realizes that this was an incredible acquisition, one of the greatest land purchases in human history. So it was worth a little bit of grief for a while. And he gets New Orleans. He wants New Orleans. He knows the importance of the Mississippi River, and we're going to double the size of our nation. Basically, what we think of as the modern United States is filled out except for what's owned by Spain in the Southwest. And we're coming. That spoiler alert. We're coming for that too. All right. So already you have secessionist schemes going on. Thomas Jefferson's vice president is a man by the name of Aaron Burr. Who he's Aaron Burr and Hamilton don't get along, Alexander Hamilton, and he challenges Hamilton to a duel. And Hamilton is not fighting the same fight. This is like an honor thing, but Hamilton doesn't go there thinking his life is on the line. And he's going to fire his pistol into the air, and Aaron Burr is going to fire his pistol into his chest. He's going to kill Alexander Hamilton. He murders him. He murders Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton, he is the vice president of the United States. So he flees to the Southwest, which is Spanish territory, and evades capture by running away from the country. And now Alexander Hamilton, this brainchild of our financial trust, is dead. So it's a pretty crazy thing in American history. Lewis and Clark, of course, have their expedition to explore the Louisiana Purchase. It's something that takes a couple of years. They meet new Indians like the Mandans and the Sioux. It's a scientific voyage. They're checking out this new territory that we bought, seeing exactly what we have. They have a ton of interactions with natives along the way. That's where you get Sacagawea and other Indian guides involved. And they're going to go all the way to the ends of our newly acquired territory. All right. Now, when we talk about Thomas Jefferson, he's a two-term president. His first term is very successful. His second term is not. And when you think of his first term, you think Louisiana Purchase and getting rid of some of Adams' stupid stuff. In the second part of his term, you think Embargo Act of 1807. The British are doing British things. They are not treating us with respect. They're seizing ships, forcing sailors into the British Navy, both Americans and English sailors, forcing them to fight with them against the French. And so to show them that we don't appreciate this, Jefferson decides to pass something called the Embargo Act of 1807. What it does is it cuts off all trade with all countries. We're basically going to become isolated. We're not trading with you guys. We're not going to trade with Britain because then France treats us bad. We're not going to trade with France because then Britain treats us bad. So we're just not trading with you guys. It's a huge mistake. We lose so much money, and it kills a lot of businesses here in America. It's a lot. It hurt us more than it hurt Britain and France, without a doubt. And you get these other embargoes and stuff like that, but it's all a terrible idea. Now, with all of this, you are beginning to get war hawks. War hawks are the people who are aggressive and who say war sometimes is the best answer and it'll solve our problems. Henry Clay is a war hawk. But we've got domestic problems with the Indians and foreign problems with Britain and France. You got Indians under Tecumseh. They're being provided guns by the British. So that's a big issue. We're not happy with Britain for that. And, now we've got this real threat on our western border. But Tecumseh and his coalition are eventually defeated by William Henry Harrison, who becomes a president at the Battle of Tippecanoe, and there'll be songs made about the Battle of Tippecanoe. Americans love to elect war heroes as presidents. Henry Clay is a name that's not going anywhere. Get familiar with him, the great compromiser. He is elected Speaker of the House. He and other Southern and Western congressmen, such as John C. Calhoun, another name you're gonna know, they're pushing for war. Most of the Federalists are against the war because Federalists are from the cities. They're more of the manufacturers, and this war the Embargo Act and the treatment is killing them. And so, a war, they would like to trade their items with Britain and France. And if they go to war with Britain and France, then they're not, or in this case, Britain, not France anymore, but Britain. We've gone beyond France, and it's Britain is seen as the enemy here. If we go to war with Britain, then it's going to upset trade, and that's going to be a lot of money, and it's going to affect them. So they're not for war. They don't think we can win the war. Whereas Democrat Republicans, they're ready to go. This will be the end of the Federalist Party because we get really lucky and we win the War of 1812. And so they get cast as anti-American, weak, soft, whatnot. So nationalist Republicans pursue policies similar to the Federalists. You get John Marshall's Federalist view here. John Marshall is the Supreme Court Justice. He's the head honcho of the Supreme Court. He believes in strengthening the power of the federal government and the Supreme Court, and we're going to see that. He asserts national supremacy in McCulloch versus Maryland. Um, the Bank of the United States was declared constitutional. You had an issue where state banks had an issue with they felt like there was too many advantages held by the national bank, the Bank of the United States. And states cannot tax a federal government agency. They were trying to tax the bus out of existence. And under John Marshall, they're gonna pass this decision that says no, states can't tax a federal government agency. You get another one, Gibbons versus Ogden. Only Congress and not the states can control interstate commerce. So New York can control New York business, but once that business is passing from New York to, say, Pennsylvania Pennsylvania, then it becomes federal. And so if you were an anti-federalist, now you're starting to see things that you were probably a little bit concerned about with the ratification of the Constitution, because as soon as it's ratified, the national government will continue to gain power year by year, president by president. Now, John Marshall does uphold vested property rights. In Dartmouth College versus Woodward, it says contracts cannot be impaired by the government. So you basically can't come in and tear apart contracts that have been made between people. There's some and a little bit here about the diplomacy of John Quincy Adams, who is the Secretary of State. He is John Adams' son. So you have a political family here, dynasty. You had the Adam-Onis Treaty, where America gains Florida. We now get us a new state. And to do that, this is made with Spain. We're going to give up any kind of claims to Texas at the moment. And we're coming back for Texas later on. But in 1819, we're going to give up those claims so that we can get Florida. The Monroe Doctrine is very important. It comes out in 1820. It says Europe must stay out of the Western Hemisphere, and America would not get involved in European affairs. Basically, you don't come sniffing around my territory, and we won't mess with you. That's what it is. Now, this is after we win the War of 1812. And the War of 1812 doesn't go good for America. It doesn't say much about it here, so I'll give you a little bit. Early on, we're losing significantly. The British even burned the White House. We invade into Canada because that's owned by Britain, and we're beaten back by the Canadians on the Great Lakes. Our biggest battle happens after the war is officially over. The Battle of New Orleans happens in 1815 under the command of Andrew Jackson, which makes him a war hero and a political figure coming up. But the war's already been over. It just took too long for the information to get to him. Why do we win? Not because we're superior to the British yet. We're not. We will be one day, but we're not here because they're fighting some guy in France named Napoleon. And so they are fighting Napoleon and us at the same time. And they're going to beat Napoleon, but only after they stop messing with us. So allowing us to win this war basically allows them to beat Napoleon in that war. So you recap, make sure you know Alexander Hamilton's financial plan and how the Bank of the United States is the cornerstone of it. The division between Jeffersonians and Federalists. Who are their supporters? What are their visions? Federalists are more city folk, manufacturing. Jeffersonians are country folk, agrarian, farmers. The French Revolution divides our country. Washington responds with neutrality. The Whiskey Rebellion shows that our government can put down revolts, shows the strength of this new constitution. The Haitian Revolution scares our slave owners, so they're not sure how much they can support this new government. The XYZ affair happens under John Adams, and it angers us, puts many people against France because they're asking for a bribe to even talk to their leaders. The Revolution of 1800, also called the Bloodless Revolution, is Thomas Jefferson beating John Adams, his enemy, his political rival, and it being done without any blood, assassinations, or anything like that. John Marshall is the first Supreme Court justice, and there are a couple of important cases, probably the most important being Marbury versus Madison, which says national law trumps state law when the two collide. We get the Louisiana Purchase under Thomas Jefferson in his first term. and we get Henry Clay, Warhawk, Henry Clay. We'll talk a lot more about Henry Clay in the next segment. Okay, thanks for listening, guys, and take good